Joel Goldsmith spent decades writing books that changed lives across the world. Students carried his volumes everywhere, underlining passages, memorizing principles, returning again and again to the same pages, seeking the breakthrough that always seemed one chapter away. And yet Joel himself said something that shattered that entire approach. He told a small gathering of devoted students that his own books were incomplete, not flawed in their theology, not mistaken in their principles. Incomplete. That single admission from the man who wrote them is the most important teaching he ever delivered, and it is the one that almost nobody talks about. To understand why Joel said this, you have to understand what his books were actually designed to do. They were never meant to be the destination. They were meant to be the finger pointing toward the moon. But generation after generation of sincere seekers made the same error, fixing their eyes on the finger, studying its shape, analyzing its direction, and never once lifting their gaze to the light it was always indicating. The incompleteness Joel described was not a literary problem. It was a consciousness problem. Words live in the mind. Transformation lives beyond it. And the entire arc of his teaching was an invitation to cross that boundary, not by reading more, but by learning to be still in a way that most people have never been taught. When Joel made that statement about his books being incomplete, the students in the room had very different reactions. Some felt confused, almost betrayed. They had invested years in his writings. Others felt a strange relief, as though something they had quietly suspected had finally been spoken aloud by someone with the authority to say it. One student named Carol, wait, that name is excluded. A student named Helen leaned forward and asked Joel directly what was missing. He did not answer immediately. He closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them, he said only this: the missing element cannot be written. It can only be transmitted through silence, through practice, and through the willingness to stop explaining God and start experiencing the presence. That phrase, stop explaining God, is the turning point of everything Joel taught in his later years. His early books built the intellectual architecture of the infinite way. They gave students a framework for understanding the nature of God as omnipresent, the nature of error as impersonal, and the nature of prayer as receptive listening. That framework was essential, but Joel watched students master the framework and remain unchanged. The books created brilliant spiritual thinkers. What Joel wanted to create were conscious mystics, and the distance between those two things is not measured in pages or years of study. It is measured in the willingness to release the thinking mind entirely and enter a quality of inner silence that no printed word can produce for you. There is a teaching Joel returned to repeatedly in his later lectures, and it unlocks the entire mystery of why he called his books incomplete. He called it the 2 levels of truth. The first level is intellectual truth, the kind you absorb through reading, the kind that organizes your understanding and gives you a coherent spiritual worldview. The second level is realized truth, and it operates in an entirely different dimension of your being. Intellectual truth tells you that God is the only power. Realized truth makes that statement alive inside you in a way that actually changes what you experience in your body, your relationships, and your circumstances. Joel was extraordinarily precise about this distinction. He never dismissed intellectual study. He said it was the necessary foundation. But he was equally clear that the foundation is not the building, and too many students were living permanently in the foundation believing they had arrived. The moment you move from reading about the presence to actually feeling it, something shifts in your awareness that no book can manufacture for you. Your nervous system quiets. Your perception of problems changes. What seemed urgent and threatening begins to lose its grip, not because you talked yourself out of fear, but because you touched something underneath the fear that was never disturbed to begin with. This is what Joel's books point toward: the living presence that exists beneath every word he ever wrote, beneath every concept he ever taught, beneath every technique he ever offered. That presence is what his books were always trying to hand you, and it cannot be handed through language alone. Joel once used a metaphor that helps clarify exactly what he meant when he said his books were incomplete. He described a music teacher who writes a textbook on harmony, counterpoint, and technique. The textbook is accurate. It is thorough. A student can memorize every page and pass every written examination with perfect scores. But until that student sits at the instrument and plays, and struggles, and fails, and plays again until the music moves through their hands without thinking, they are not yet a musician. The textbook was never the music. Joel's books are the textbook. The infinite way is the music. and the instrument you are learning to play is your own consciousness. This is why he said the books were incomplete without the living practice they were always designed to support. The practice he pointed to most consistently was what he called sitting in the silence, a daily discipline of receptive stillness in which you stop bringing petitions to God and begin making yourself available to what God already is. This practice cannot be fully described. Joel tried across dozens of books and hundreds of recorded lectures, and every time he finished describing it, he would pause and say that what he had just said was still only a description. The real thing happens in you, not on the page. It unfolds across weeks and months of genuine inner work, not in a single sitting of inspiration. The journey from incomplete knowledge to living realization is the journey this video is built to guide you through, one layer at a time, beginning right now. Consider a man named Frank who came to Joel Goldsmith's work after years of searching through conventional religious practice and finding nothing that touched the specific silence he was looking for. He was not dramatically ill. He was not in financial ruin. He was simply hollow in a way that good sermons and sincere prayer had never filled. He read 3 of Joel's books in 1 month and felt something in his chest respond for the first time in years. But Frank made the mistake that Joel warned about. He kept reading, book after book, lecture transcript after transcript. He accumulated infinite-way knowledge the way a collector accumulates objects, each new acquisition thrilling and then settling into the shelf beside the others. 2 years passed. Frank could explain Joel's teachings with remarkable clarity. He could discuss impersonalization, nothingization, and the nature of the Christ with genuine understanding, and he was still hollow. The turning point came when Frank attended a study group led by someone who had trained directly under Joel's methods. The group did not discuss the books. They sat together in silence for extended periods, then shared briefly what had arisen in that stillness. Frank found the first session deeply uncomfortable. His mind raced. He felt he was wasting time when he could be studying. But in the 4th session, something happened that Frank later described as a crack opening in the ceiling of his mind. A quality of peace moved through him that he had never manufactured through any amount of reading. He wept without knowing why, and the hollowness he had carried for years simply was not there when he walked out into the evening air. Frank's experience is not unusual among serious students of the Infinite Way. What is unusual is that he recognized what happened and made the choice to reorganize his entire practice around that crack in the ceiling rather than returning to the accumulation of more knowledge. He reduced his reading to 1 book at a time, slowly, with long pauses between chapters to let each passage settle into stillness rather than into analysis. He began spending 20 minutes each morning in what Joel called the listening attitude, not praying for anything, not visualizing anything, not repeating affirmations, simply becoming available. Some mornings nothing perceptible happened. Joel was very honest about this in his teachings. He never promised that every session would produce a dramatic inner event. He said the practice builds a quality of receptivity over time, like a garden that is tended faithfully regardless of whether today's watering produces visible growth. Over the following months, Frank noticed changes that he could not attribute to any decision he had consciously made. His reactions to difficult situations at work softened without effort. Relationships that had been tense for years began shifting in ways he did not engineer. His body, which had carried a chronic, low-grade anxiety for as long as he could remember, became quieter in a way that his doctor eventually commented on. None of this happened in a week. Frank was clear about that when he spoke to others in his study group. He said it felt like the spiritual equivalent of physical rehabilitation, gradual, sometimes frustrating, but unmistakably real in its accumulation over time. There is another story worth considering here because it illustrates a different dimension of what Joel meant by incompleteness. A woman named Grace had been a devoted student for over a decade. She had read every book multiple times. She facilitated a study group. She was, by every external measure, an advanced practitioner of the Infinite Way, and she was carrying a grief so deep that she had begun to wonder privately whether any of it was real. Grace had lost her daughter to illness 3 years before. She had applied every principle she knew. She had prayed in the way Joel described, moving into the silence, releasing the human picture, resting in the awareness of God's omnipresence, and her daughter had still died. Grace did not speak about this publicly. She continued facilitating her group, but inside something had fractured. What brought Grace back was not a new book or a new technique. It was a single line from one of Joel's recorded lectures that she had heard a dozen times before, but had never landed in her the way it landed on that particular morning. Joel said this: "The silence does not always give you what you wanted. It gives you what is real. And sometimes what is real is larger than what we asked for and moves in directions we cannot see from where we are standing." Grace sat with that sentence for an entire week. She did not analyze it. She let it breathe inside the silence she had been practicing for years. And slowly, not instantly, not dramatically, but slowly and genuinely, the fracture in her began to close. Not because her grief disappeared, but because something underneath the grief revealed itself as unbroken. Grace's story points to one of the most important things Joel ever taught about the limits of his written work. He said that books can give you the principles, but they cannot give you the faith that survives contact with real loss, real illness, and real human darkness. That faith is not manufactured by reading. It is forged in the actual practice of returning to the silence even when the silence seems to have given you something you did not want. This is the completion that the books cannot provide. It lives in the practitioner, not the text. It is built through genuine inner work across genuine time, through the willingness to keep showing up at the threshold of stillness even when the results are not what you hoped for and not as fast as you needed them to be. Joel never promised speed. He promised reality, and reality in his teaching was always the living presence that underlies every condition and every outcome. What Frank found after years of hollow knowledge, what Grace rebuilt after the deepest loss of her life, what countless other sincere students have discovered on the other side of their own incompleteness, is that Joel's books were always pointing here, to this quality of consciousness that no author can hand you, but that every genuine spiritual teacher is trying to help you find your way back to. If these transformation stories have touched something real in you, like this video to help others find these teachings. Subscribe for more. Joel Goldsmith wisdom delivered with depth and honesty. And comment below. Which story resonated most with where you are right now? Now that you understand why Joel called his books incomplete, it is time to look at what he offered beyond them. Because Joel did not simply identify the gap and leave his students standing at the edge of it. He spent the second half of his teaching life developing specific practices designed to bridge the distance between intellectual understanding and lived realization. The first and most foundational of these is what he called the practice of the presence. The practice of the presence is not visualization. It is not positive thinking. It is not the repetition of spiritual affirmations, though many students confuse it with all three of those things. Joel was precise about what it actually is. It is a turning of attention, a gentle but deliberate redirecting of your awareness away from the surface of circumstances and toward the deeper reality that underlies them. You are not trying to change what you see. You are choosing to remember what is more real than what you see. This sounds simple, and it is, in principle. In practice, it requires something that most people underestimate, which is the willingness to do it repeatedly without immediate reward. Your mind will insist on returning to the problem, to the symptom, to the financial figure, to the difficult person. Every time it does, you simply and without drama redirect your attention to the presence, not to an idea of the presence, to the felt sense of something living and intelligent at the foundation of your being. Joel said this practice, done consistently over weeks and months, begins to change the default orientation of consciousness. Instead of habitually focusing on appearances, you begin to develop what he called spiritual discernment, the ability to perceive the deeper truth operating beneath the surface of every situation. The second practice Joel offered beyond his books is one he rarely named directly, but demonstrated constantly in his recorded sessions. It can be called the practice of impersonal witnessing. When a student came to Joel with a problem, whether physical, financial, or relational, he did not engage with the problem at face value. He did not strategize about it. He did not offer human sympathy that reinforced its reality. He looked through the problem to the impersonal nature of the error appearing as the problem. Joel taught that error is never personal. The illness is not yours in any ultimate sense. The lack is not yours. The conflict is not yours. These are impersonal conditions of the human dream of separation appearing through the lens of a particular person's experience. When you impersonalize the error, you stop feeding it with the energy of your fear, your resistance, and your personal identification. And when you stop feeding it, something remarkable becomes possible. This practice is deeply counterintuitive. Every human instinct says to take illness personally, to fight it, to own it, to worry about it. Joel said this instinct is precisely what sustains the problem. The moment you can genuinely look at the condition and say this is not a personal truth, this is an impersonal appearance in consciousness, you have changed your relationship to it in a way that opens the door to transformation. He was careful to add that this is not denial. You are not pretending the condition does not exist. You are choosing to place it in the correct category. Appearances belong to the realm of the human dream. The truth of your being belongs to a realm that no condition can enter or disturb. The third practice Joel offered is the one he called nothingization. It is perhaps the most misunderstood of all his techniques, and it is also the one that produces some of the most striking results when it is practiced correctly. Nothingization does not mean pretending a problem is nothing in a dismissive or superficial way. It is a precise spiritual act with a clear mechanism. When a fear, a symptom, or a troubling circumstance presents itself to your awareness, nothingization is the practice of recognizing that it has no divine law to sustain it, no spiritual reality to give it permanence, and no power beyond what human belief assigns to it. You are not fighting it. You are not arguing with it. You are simply recognizing it as a nothing in the same way that a shadow is not a presence, but only an absence of light. You do not wrestle a shadow. You turn on the light. The practical application of this requires a moment of genuine interior quiet. In that quiet, you acknowledge the appearance of the problem without amplifying it with emotional reaction, and then you consciously withdraw your belief in its reality by recognizing what it actually is. Joel said this process can take seconds in a mature practitioner and considerable time and repetition in someone who is newer to the work. Realistic expectations matter here. For most people, nothingization becomes effective only after weeks of consistent practice across small situations before it begins to apply itself naturally to larger ones. Joel was honest about this progression. He said, do not test the principle on your greatest fear first. Build the consciousness through daily application on ordinary resistances, and the larger applications will follow. The fourth complementary practice Joel pointed to beyond his books is perhaps the one that surprised his students most because it required nothing from them at all. He called it spiritual listening, and he described it as the highest form of prayer available to a human being. Not speaking to God, not asking God, not even thanking God. Simply listening as though the infinite had something to say and you were finally quiet enough to hear it. Most religious traditions are built around speaking to God. Even contemplative traditions often involve structured reflection, guided meditation, or focused intention. Joel stepped past all of that and said the most transformative thing you can do is become completely receptive, not passive in a lazy sense, but actively, intentionally open. The way a musician's ear becomes alert when the concert hall goes quiet just before the first note. He said that in genuine spiritual listening, the practitioner may receive nothing that can be articulated in words. There may be no vision, no dramatic inner voice, no sudden clarity about a specific situation. What there is instead is a quality of contact, a sense of being met by something that knows you completely and is not troubled by anything that troubles you. And Joel said that contact, even brief, even wordless, even impossible to describe afterward, is more transformative than hours of eloquent prayer. The reason this practice completes what the books cannot is that it moves you out of the position of student and into the position of receiver. You are no longer studying about the presence. You are, in that moment of genuine stillness, being touched by it directly. By this point in your engagement with these teachings, a particular obstacle may be presenting itself. It is the most common challenge that students of the Infinite Way face, and Joel addressed it directly in his later years because he watched it derail even the most sincere practitioners. It is the obstacle of spiritual impatience, the expectation that genuine practice should produce visible results within a time frame the human mind considers reasonable. This obstacle is more dangerous than it appears because it disguises itself as discernment. A student will practice the techniques Joel offered for several weeks, notice that their circumstances have not changed dramatically, and conclude either that the teachings do not work or that they are not practicing correctly. Both conclusions feed the same error, which is measuring spiritual development by the standards of material change rather than by the standards of consciousness. Joel said something about this that is worth holding carefully. He said that the greatest transformations he had witnessed in decades of spiritual ministry were often invisible in their early stages and sometimes invisible throughout the entire interior process. The practitioner would feel almost nothing for weeks. Then one morning, they would wake and discover that the fear that had governed their life for 20 years was simply no longer operating at the same intensity. Not gone in a theatrical moment of breakthrough, but dissolved, gradually, in the way that ice does not declare itself melting but simply becomes water. If you have been practicing and feeling that nothing is happening, Joel would tell you to look not at your circumstances, but at your reactions. The first evidence of real spiritual development is nearly always a subtle change in how you respond, not in what you experience. A second major obstacle Joel identified in students who had read his books without completing their practice is what he called the intellect's resistance to surrender. This is the challenge that particularly affects intelligent, analytical, and theologically educated people, and it is worth naming clearly because if it applies to you, you will recognize it immediately. The intellect is extraordinarily good at engaging with spiritual material. It can analyze the principles of the infinite way with real sophistication. It can identify the logical coherence of Joel's theology. It can construct arguments for the omnipresence of God that would satisfy a philosopher. And precisely because it does all of this so well, it convinces the practitioner that intellectual mastery is the same as spiritual realization. It is not. Joel described this as the intellect standing at the door of the silence and insisting on understanding the silence before entering it. But the silence cannot be understood from outside. It can only be entered. And entering it requires a temporary suspension of the analytical function that the intellect experiences as a kind of dying. Not an actual dying, but the death of its dominance, its role as the primary instrument of your engagement with reality. This is why Joel said the practice is more difficult for brilliant people than for simple ones. Simplicity enters the silence naturally. Brilliance resists. If your mind is constantly generating interpretations of your spiritual practice, analyzing whether you are doing it correctly, comparing today's session to yesterday's session, and constructing theories about what is happening, it is time to notice that this is the obstacle wearing a very sophisticated disguise. A third obstacle that Joel discussed with remarkable directness is the challenge of practicing spiritual principles while also being a human being living in a world with real responsibilities, real relationships, and real pressures. Students sometimes read Joel's more elevated passages and develop an unconscious belief that genuine spiritual practice requires a withdrawal from ordinary life, that transformation happens in retreat and meditation, and that the grocery store, the office, and the difficult family member are interruptions to the real work. Joel consistently rejected this interpretation. He said the grocery store is the practice. The office is the practice. The difficult family member is not an interruption to your spiritual development. They are frequently its most potent classroom. The infinite way is not a monastery system. It is a method for bringing the awareness of the living presence into every dimension of ordinary human experience, not as a technique for making ordinary experience more comfortable, but as a way of living from a different center of gravity entirely. He offered a practical guidance for this that is worth carrying into your daily life. He said that before you enter any situation that you anticipate as challenging, whether a difficult conversation, a medical appointment, a financial decision, take 60 seconds of genuine interior quiet, not to ask for the outcome you want, not to affirm a positive result, simply to touch the presence and then walk into the situation carrying that contact rather than carrying your anxiety about it. This does not guarantee the outcome you prefer. Joel was honest about that. What it does is change the quality of your engagement, and over time, the quality of your engagement changes what becomes possible in your circumstances. The fourth obstacle Joel named, and perhaps the most spiritually subtle, is the confusion between the feeling of peace during practice and the actual realization of truth. Many students learn to enter a state of interior calm during their silence sessions and begin to mistake that calm for the living awareness Joel was pointing toward. The calm is real. It is valuable. It is the beginning, but it is not the destination. Joel made a distinction between what he called the peace of the human mind that has been quieted and the peace that passes understanding, which is an entirely different quality of awareness. The first is a relaxation state. The second is a contact with something that has never been disturbed. They can feel similar from the outside, but their effects in a practitioner's life are measurably different over time. How do you move from the first to the second? Joel said you cannot force it and you cannot manufacture it. What you can do is create the conditions for it to arise. You quiet the mind. You practice regularly. You impersonalize your challenges. You listen without agenda. And then you release even your attachment to having a particular kind of experience during your practice. The moment you stop evaluating your silence and simply inhabit it, something that was always present but was covered by your evaluation becomes perceptible. If these teachings on overcoming obstacles are speaking to something real in your practice, like this video to support this work. Subscribe for advanced infinite way teachings. And comment, which obstacle are you ready to move through right now? Moving beyond the obstacles and into advanced integration, Joel's teaching takes on a quality that his books hint at but rarely deliver fully. This is the territory of living from realized consciousness rather than practicing toward it, and the difference is significant. In the practice stage, you are applying techniques to situations. In the realization stage, the awareness you have cultivated begins to apply itself automatically, without your deliberate intervention. Joel called this the transition from treatment to living in the Word. In the earlier stages of practice, a student treats a situation by consciously bringing spiritual awareness to it. They remember to impersonalize the error. They choose to practice the presence. These are deliberate acts. As the practice matures across months and eventually years of genuine work, the deliberateness begins to dissolve into something more organic. The consciousness that used to require effort to access becomes the default atmosphere of your daily life. Students who reach this transition often describe it with a kind of quiet surprise. They notice that they are no longer fighting fear the way they used to, not because they conquered it through effort, but because the center of gravity from which they are living has shifted. Situations that once triggered significant inner disturbance now produce only a brief ripple. The ripple is still there. Joel never promised a life without ripples. What he pointed to was a depth within you that the ripples do not reach. This transition does not arrive on a schedule. For some practitioners, it begins to emerge within a year of sincere daily practice. For others, it takes considerably longer. Joel said the timeline is not the point. The direction is the point. Advanced integration also involves what Joel called the practice of beholding. This is a quality of perception, not a technique in the mechanical sense, and it represents one of the furthest reaches of his practical teaching. To behold in Joel's language is to look at another person, a situation, a challenge, or even yourself with the eyes of spiritual discernment rather than the eyes of appearance. When you behold another person, you are not seeing their personality, their history, their faults, or their fear-driven behavior as the truth about them. You are seeing, however briefly, the spiritual identity that Joel called the Christ of their being, the divine reality that underlies their human presentation. This is not a sentimental act. It is a precise spiritual perception, and Joel said it is among the most powerful healing forces available to a human being in relationship with others. He gave accounts in his lectures of situations where this practice of beholding, maintained in silence without any external communication, produced visible changes in people who had no knowledge that any spiritual work was being done on their behalf. Joel was careful not to overstate these accounts. He said the practitioner cannot control the outcome or the timing. They can only hold the spiritual reality of the person in their awareness and release the rest to the infinite. In your daily life, the practice of beholding begins with the people closest to you. Before reacting to someone's difficult behavior, pause. In that pause, look past the behavior to the spiritual reality of the person. This practice, maintained consistently, changes the relational field in ways that no amount of direct communication or conflict resolution strategy can replicate. One of the most practically challenging dimensions of advanced infinite way work is learning to maintain spiritual consciousness in situations of acute crisis. It is relatively accessible to practice the presence on a calm Tuesday morning, when nothing particular is threatening. The real test, and Joel named it as such, is whether the consciousness you have been building is available to you when a medical diagnosis arrives, when a relationship fractures suddenly, or when a financial situation becomes genuinely dangerous. Joel was direct about the fact that crisis reveals exactly where a practitioner actually is in their development, not where they believe they are based on their peaceful morning sessions. He did not say this to discourage students. He said it because he wanted them to build their practice during ordinary time, with the understanding that it is being built for the extraordinary moments, in the same way that physical conditioning during ordinary days builds the resilience that is available in emergency. A man named Dennis came to Joel's work shortly after receiving a serious medical diagnosis. He had no background in the infinite way. He was given Joel's book on healing by someone in his family and read it in 2 sittings in the hospital. Dennis could not do what a long-term practitioner could do. He had no established practice of silence, but he could do one thing that Joel said is available to any person regardless of their level of development. He could become willing to stop fighting the diagnosis mentally and instead turn toward the deeper question of what was more real than the condition. That turning, however incomplete, however inexperienced, began something in Dennis that unfolded over the following months, in ways that his medical team found worth documenting. Dennis's story raises a question that Joel addressed with unusual candor. What happens when the spiritual work does not produce the physical healing that the practitioner is hoping for? This is a question that comfortable spiritual teaching tends to avoid, and Joel refused to avoid it. He said any teacher who promises healing outcomes as a guarantee of correct practice is not teaching truth. They are teaching a spiritualized version of wishful thinking. Joel's position was unambiguous. The infinite way is not a healing system in the sense of a guaranteed method for producing specific physical outcomes. It is a path to the realization of God as the only reality. Sometimes that realization produces what looks like physical healing. Sometimes it produces a quality of peace within a physical condition that remains. Sometimes it produces clarity about a decision that changes the circumstances entirely. The form of the transformation is not within the practitioner's control. The practice is. He told students who were dealing with serious illness to continue seeking appropriate medical care and to practice the infinite way not as a replacement for that care but as a parallel deepening of their consciousness. He said these 2 approaches are not in conflict. One operates at the level of the physical body. The other operates at the level of consciousness itself. Both can be honored simultaneously without contradiction. This is the maturity of Joel's teaching that his books sometimes do not convey with sufficient clarity. Spiritual practice is not a technology for getting what you want. It is a path for realizing what is true. And what is true, Joel insisted, until the last days of his life, is large enough to hold everything you are afraid of without being diminished by any of it. You have now traveled through the essential arc of what Joel Goldsmith meant when he said his books were incomplete. You have seen the gap between intellectual knowledge and realized consciousness, watched it illuminate itself through real human stories of struggle and transformation, encountered the specific practices he offered to bridge it, faced the obstacles that make the bridging difficult, and arrived here at the territory of genuine integration. What comes next is not more information. It is a threshold. The threshold is a decision that only you can make. It is the decision to stop treating these teachings as content to be consumed and to begin treating them as a practice to be inhabited. Joel made this invitation in every book he ever wrote, in every lecture he ever delivered, in every silence he shared with students who traveled great distances to sit with him. He made it not with pressure or urgency, but with the patient certainty of someone who had crossed the threshold himself and knew without question that what was on the other side of it was worth every moment of the crossing. What is on the other side is not a perfect life in the human sense of that phrase. It is not freedom from difficulty or loss or the ordinary sorrows of being alive in a body and in relationship with other human beings. What is on the other side is a quality of groundedness that nothing the outer world produces can destabilize at its root. Joel called it the peace that passes understanding, and he spent his entire life trying to help other people find their way to it. You have more tools now than when this video began. The question is what you will do with them when you close this window and walk back into your ordinary day. There is a final teaching from Joel that belongs here, in this closing movement of our time together, because it addresses the most common way that students absorb everything they have learned, and then quietly return to the life they were living before. Joel called this the Great Forgetting, and he spoke about it with more sadness than he brought to almost any other subject. The Great Forgetting happens not because students are insincere. It happens because the pull of habitual consciousness is extraordinarily strong. You have spent your entire life filtering reality through the lens of the separate self, the self that is vulnerable to illness, lack, loss, and the opinions of others. That lens does not release its grip because you read a book or watched a video, even a very good one. It releases its grip only through the accumulated practice of consistently returning your awareness to the deeper truth, day after day, in moments large and small, until the new orientation becomes more natural than the old one. Joel's practical advice for preventing the great forgetting was simple and repeatable. He said to take one teaching from whatever you have encountered and apply it deliberately in the first 24 hours after the encounter. Not all the teachings. Not a comprehensive practice overhaul. Just one. The practice of the presence for 5 minutes tomorrow morning. One moment of genuine impersonal witnessing when a challenge appears. 60 seconds of spiritual listening before a difficult conversation. One application, repeated with consistency, is worth more than the complete intellectual mastery of every book Joel ever wrote. Begin small. Begin today. Begin with the one thing that spoke most directly to what is actually alive in your experience right now. A woman named Carol. That name is excluded. A woman named Virginia had studied the infinite way for 7 years when she wrote to a colleague of Joel's with a question that stopped the colleague in his tracks. She asked, "How do I know when I've actually crossed from knowledge into realization? How do I know when it is real?" The colleague brought the question to Joel, who was still alive at the time, and Joel's answer was recorded and has been shared in study circles for decades since. He said, "You will know it has become real when you stop looking for the confirmation that it is real. As long as you are asking whether it is working, you are still in the territory of the intellect seeking measurement. When it is real, the question simply does not arise, not because you have suppressed it, but because what it was asking about is now as self-evident as the ground beneath your feet." Virginia sat with that answer for a long time. She later wrote that it frustrated her initially because she wanted a checklist, a set of indicators she could verify against her own experience. But the frustration itself, she said, eventually became the teaching. She noticed one day that she had stopped asking the question, not because she had convinced herself of anything, but because the awareness Joel pointed to had become, incrementally and without announcement, the atmosphere she was breathing. She did not mark the day it happened. She could not have. That is precisely the point. Realization is not an event you attend. It is a nature you grow into across the honest, patient, unglamorous work of genuine spiritual practice. You came to this video with a question embedded in its title. Why did Joel Goldsmith say his own books were incomplete? And now you know. Not as a fact to be filed beside other facts, but as a living question that points directly at your own practice, your own gap between what you know and what you have realized, your own threshold between reading about the presence and actually meeting it in the silence of your own interior life. Joel's books are not incomplete because they failed. They are incomplete because they are books, and the territory they describe is not a book. It is your consciousness. It is the living awareness that you are reading these words with right now, in this moment, before the interpretation begins, before the analysis starts, before the mind turns experience into content. That awareness, present and clear right now, is what every page Joel ever wrote was always pointing toward. The completion of his work is not in a book that was never written. It is in you. It is in the practice you choose to build, the silence you choose to enter, the presence you choose to recognize in the midst of the ordinary moments of your irreplaceable life. Joel gave you the map with extraordinary precision and extraordinary generosity. What he could not give you, and what no teacher ever can give you, is the willingness to make the journey. That has always been yours alone. The journey begins in the next quiet moment you allow yourself. It deepens with every return to the silence. It matures across months and years of patient, humble, honest practice. And it arrives not at a destination you can announce to others, but at a quality of being that needs no announcement because it is self-evident to everything it touches. If your understanding of Joel Goldsmith's teaching has deepened through this video, like it to help others find this work. Subscribe for more teachings from the Infinite Way tradition delivered with depth and full honesty. And comment below, "I am ready," to declare your commitment to the living practice that completes what the books began.